Hi, everyone. Good evening. I just want to quickly go ahead and introduce our speaker for tonight, Professor Jennifer Victor. I will give a brief intro to our amazing professor. She is an associate professor of political science here at George Mason, and she joined our faculty in 2012. Professor Victor's interest area includes the U.S. Congress, legislative organization and behavior, social networking methods, political parties, campaign finance, and organized interest groups and lobbying, excuse me. She has been published in many journals, including the American Journal of Political Science, the British Journal of Political Science, American Political Research as well. So she's definitely, an expert on this topic. And tonight she'll be giving a sample class to introduce fundamental political science related to elections and voting and apply them to help understand the 2020 elections. So very current. In this sample class, we want to give you all a taste for the discussions that we have at the Schar School and how we have these discussions. So please feel free to ask questions in the Q&A box. I'll be helping to moderate as well. And Professor Victor, whenever you're ready, please take it away.
All right, thank you very much, Rachel and Paul. And hopefully we'll get a few more people that wander in here, but if not, I'm happy to have a more intimate group to be able to interact with. I'll say at the outset that when I teach real classes rather than sample classes, this would work quite a bit differently. I favor a method, particularly during COVID times, that includes both asynchronous and synchronous content. So I'll put up readings and pre-recorded videos and other sort of lessons that you can do on your own time, and then have a synchronous portion where we come together more for discussion and examples and going over, whatever students like to go over based on the other pre-recorded lessons and so forth. And so tonight's lesson or lecture is going to be quite a bit different because it's going to be a lecture. And to be honest with you, that's not how I usually do graduate classes. I don't lecture that much to my graduate classes. I give them a lot of readings and we do a bunch of discussion and exploration on our own. And I hit our learning objectives in a more Socratic format. In this particular Zoom webinar format, it's really hard to do that interactive Socratic thing. And so instead, I've planned something that's a little bit more of a traditional lecture. And to be honest with you, I've planned way too much. I'm not sure that we can actually get through all of the material that I've planned for today. If I could sort of read the room, which is going to be hard for me to do, I might figure out which parts of the talk I could go faster on and which parts I can go slower on. So feel free to use the chat liberally. I don't know if when I get to my screen share here, if I'll be able to monitor the chat, but hopefully Rachel and Paul can kind of help guide me to some extent. Otherwise, I'm going to talk at you and then leave some time for questions and hopefully some discussion. So, okay, let me go ahead and share my screen and I can get the slide presentation going here. All right, so what I can see now really is just Rachel and Paul, so, and I can't see the chat. So if one of you could give me a thumbs up that this is sharing fine and seeing fine and you can hear me okay, that would be helpful.
You are doing good, yeah.
Okay, great, thanks. All right, so feel free to, don't hesitate to interrupt me. I'm gonna start talking a lot, but seriously, if there's a question that somebody wants clarification on, or you want me to go faster or slower on things, please interrupt me and say so. Because like I said, I can't see you, and that's sometimes an uncomfortable way to give a presentation. Okay, so my area of expertise is in US Congress, but the research that I'm working on right now focuses on polarization. And I spend a lot of time thinking about elections and political parties. That naturally leads to a lot of hemming and hawing over what's going on in US democracy right now. And so thinking about putting all of this information in the context of a health check, I sort of have these four main goals that I'm hoping that we'll talk about today. So first, I want to have a little bit more of an esoteric theoretical discussion about what the purpose of voting in elections is. My preference is to do that particular discussion with a lot of readings behind us and do it in a discussion Socratic format. So instead, I'm just going to tell you the answers. But then after we get through those foundations, then I want to talk about an area that I'm just going to call election fundamentals. You know, especially now when we're in sort of the home stretch of a presidential campaign, there's a lot of buzz in the air about everyday election events. There was the debate last night and what a disaster it was, and somebody said this thing and that's going to cause a crisis, and like there's this horse race news cycle that feels like this impossible treadmill, and every event that happens seems like it's going to blow up the whole system. When in reality, we can actually think of a lot of those day-to-day election-oriented campaign events as noise and focus on much larger, more informative signals by looking at the historical record about how elections work, to give us some information about election outcomes. And so I want to talk about those election fundamentals for helping us understand election outcomes better. You probably don't need any help with this part, but I am going to try to briefly summarize what makes 2020 different as an election in the United States. And then all of that will provide, those three things will provide us the foundation for the main purpose of the talk, the title of the purpose here, which is helping us to evaluate the health of US democracy. All right, so like I said, way too much to cover, and we'll just see how far we get. And you guys can tell me to just stop talking so fast at some point. All right, so the first thing I want to go over is the idea of why do we have elections and why do people vote? And in the political science literature, there's more or less three broad theories that we have developed over time that help us understand why people vote. And I'm going to basically call these folk theory, spatial theory, and social theory. And I'm just going to describe each one. So folk theory of democracy is this idea that I think of as almost the romantic idea of how democracy works. And I'm gonna kind of explain the fantasy and the theory of why we think of it as this folk theory of democracy, and then I'm gonna cut it down. And this is drawn from work largely from Christopher Aiken and Larry Bartels in their 2017 book called Democracy for Realists, which is a fantastic book. And what they do is they lay out this conventional wisdom about why democracy works. And if we had an actual discussion class here, I might ask you and you'd say, well, in democracy, we use elections as a mechanism to hold elected people accountable. So it's a system of self-governance, and but we don't have direct democracy for everything. We have a representative body like a legislature or whatnot, and we use elections to hold those representatives accountable. If we don't like the policies they pass, we vote them out. If we do like what they're doing, we vote them back in. And the incentives that the voters provide for either voting people out or back into office gives the representatives the appropriate motivations to enact good governance and make good policy. Okay, and so we can sort of think of this as a cycle, this sort of self-feeding cycle, where the voters select the leaders, and then the leaders create the policies, and then the policies affect the voters, and then voters evaluate. Like the policy, don't like the policy, and that then determines what they do with the leaders. They either re-elect the leaders or they don't, depending on how they feel about the policy. And so you have this cycle that we think of as the folk theory of democracy, and this is the romantic version of why democracy is a good system. Turns out this is wrong. And the reason it's wrong is because we are human and we have human brains and they're flawed. Okay, so one of the reasons the folk theory is wrong is because most people don't pay attention to politics, right? So in order for that folk magic to work, it has to be the case that people know what the policies are and can trace them back to and associate them with the politicians. But most people don't really know what's going on. They don't pay attention to the day-to-day stuff. They don't know what bills have been passed. They might not even know who their representatives are. So that fundamental lack of information is a first problem. Secondly, it turns out that we can show that when voters go to cast their ballot, they are very strongly influenced in their vote choice by recent events. So, and there's some wonderful, clever studies, cool experiments that looked at shark attacks and things like this that are fun to talk about in a classroom setting. But basically, they were able to show that in beach communities, this study was done many years ago, but in beach communities along the Jersey Shore, areas where there were more shark attacks, those voters that fall were less likely to vote the incumbent back into the office, even though the incumbents had nothing to do with how many sharks there were. It's just that voters didn't like what had happened and there were economic effects. And so at the end of the day, what the studies are trying to emphasize is that voters have a sort of irrational association between the events that go on in their everyday lives and what they've experienced personally and recently, and attribute those to the incumbents who hold office. And sometimes it's an inappropriate attribution, that the incumbents may not be able to affect the thing that the people are upset about, like the sharks, or that they're reacting to a shark attack that just occurred, perhaps, when in reality, they're discounting all of the other perhaps good things that the politician may have done over the course of the previous 4 years or something like that. And so the recency of the shark attack is what really drives the vote choice. So in the end, what we have is a system in which election outcomes aren't determined by voters holding incumbents accountable. Rather, voters are making their decisions based on partisan loyalty, based on these cognitive biases that we have, that we all have because we all have these flawed human brains, and by the identities, the political identities that they develop over time. And those things are much more strongly determining our vote choice than is this idea of electoral accountability. So if that's the case, it means the folk theory doesn't work, right? Because we're not actually holding people accountable. What we're doing is making vote choices based on these other things that really have nothing to do, perhaps, with politics. Okay, the second theory that we've used to help understand why we vote and have elections is known as the spatial model of voting. So in the spatial model, this is developed by Duncan Black and Anthony Downs in the 1950s and others. And essentially what they said is we can think of candidates and voters as existing on a one-dimensional left-right ideological spectrum. And candidates will position themselves on this spectrum in a place that will allow them to attract the most voters possible. And the voters then will vote for the candidate who is nearest to them. And so we could draw a simple model of this. If we were in a classroom and I had a whiteboard, I'd make this interactive and we'd draw it out. But essentially the idea is you have candidate A on the left and candidate B on the right. And all of the blue voters there are closer to candidate A and will support candidate A. And all of the red voters are closer to candidate B and will support candidate B. And the voters that are in the gray area, those that fall closer to A on the left side of the median voter line there, will support candidate A, and the other ones will support candidate B. And it gives the candidates actually an incentive to move closer to the median voter. But at the end of the day, it is the median voter's choice. Whichever way the median decides, if the median is closer to A or to B, it's that median voter who determines where the election outcome, which candidate will win. All right, so in this basic spatial understanding of how voting in elections works, we can tear this one down pretty easily too, because one of the things that we're doing in this model is we're assuming that everyone votes. We're assuming that voting isn't costly. And that we happen to know is not the case, right? In elections, depending on what kind of election we're talking about, you know, maybe as many 60% of the electorate will vote. So what if everybody doesn't vote? Well, that's a flaw in the spatial model. What if voters have trouble identifying where the candidates are? You know, you have to have really good information available to everybody in order to understand that. What if the candidates aren't static? What if they say one thing to one audience and another thing to another audience, and they have sort of a dynamic, hard to figure out position in this one-dimensional space? That's another problem in the model. And what if the candidate who is nearest you, you just don't like for some reason, they rub you the wrong way, or you're racist or sexist, or find some other reason to not be attracted to that particular candidate? That could also throw a wrench into the spatial model, right? So the spatial model is mathematically provable, like it is an equilibrium, it is correct, but it is also based on assumptions that are perhaps unreasonable to assume in a regular society of people. Okay. The third model of voting that I want to introduce is what I'm going to call the social model of voting. And it's been developed by people like Meredith Rolfe and Liliana Mason, Betsy Sinclair, and a bunch of others. And essentially here what they have observed is that an individual's decision to vote, both whether or not to vote and how to vote, is never made in isolation of others. It's always dependent on a social context. And in fact, they've been able to show through experimentation and various forms of studies that you literally cannot understand an individual decision about voting without understanding something about the people that that voter interacts with. So your decision to vote is based on whether or not the people that you live with, are they voting and how are they voting? The people that you work with, the people that you run into in your neighborhood, your family members, how all of those people think about voting and talk about voting, and whether or not they participate and how enthusiastic they are, all of that in your social space affects how you think about voting and whether or not you vote and how you vote. And so the biggest predictors of voting often have to do with social context. So how large is your personal network? How educated are you? Education is essentially socially determined. How old are you? Older people are more likely to vote because they live in different social situations. How strongly rooted are you in your community? How partisan are you? Has somebody else asked you to vote? Are you white? Are you wealthy? All of those are characteristics that are correlated with voting, not because of something intrinsic about those racial and social and educational level characteristics as individuals, but because of what they say about the social context in which you live. Okay, so at the end of the day then, the reason we vote is because voting is a social activity. It turns out, because of the Aiken and Bartel stuff I talked about earlier, elections are actually a terrible mechanism for accountability, for holding politicians accountable. And in fact, what elections are good for is generating community. So why do people vote? They vote out of an expression of social identity. They vote out of a sense of solidarity with others. They vote out of a sense of civic duty and civic connection. And so we have elections, not so much because we need them to hold people accountable, because they're actually not great at doing that. We need other democratic mechanisms for accountability. But one reason we hold elections is because it's not a democracy otherwise. Another is that it provides a source of legitimacy for democratic institutions. And then a third is to feel represented and to feel connected and to build social community at a local level. Okay, so that's a little bit of the theory, and I threw a lot of authors and literature at you in there. That would be a couple of weeks worth of pretty heavy reading in a graduate class. But that's sort of a real quick and dirty version of the purpose of voting and the purpose of elections in a democracy. Okay, let me move on now to election fundamentals. These are things you're familiar with, so I'm going to run through this part pretty fast. But here what I want to argue is that there are three factors that are structural factors about an election that largely predict election outcomes. So if we know the incumbent party's approval rating, the perceived state of the economy, and the duration in which the incumbent has held office, with those three pieces of information, we can by and large predict presidential election outcomes in the United States. Okay, so first I'm going to use 2016 as an example here because we know the outcome of that election, and so that's helpful, and then we'll apply it to 2020. So let me start with fundamental number one, incumbent approval rating. In the 12 elections between 1948 and 1992, when the party controlling the White House had a July presidential approval rating that exceeded 50%, it won. Okay, so if we look here at President Obama's job approval rating, over the course of his presidency, you can see here that over the course of his presidency, so the black is approval and the red is disapproval. And so in July of 2016, which is sort of the key indicator here, President Obama's approval rating was around 50%. So that's kind of knife edge. That sort of suggests that it would be a close election. It doesn't really suggest a strong, maybe a slight advantage for Democrats, but not a strong one. State of the economy, fundamental number two. The fundamental here that we're going to use is the most predictive indicator is the second quarter growth domestic product growth rate is predictive of excuse me, incumbent support. So here in 2016, if we look at the second quarter GDP change in GDP, we can see that it was very moderate growth. It wasn't negative, and it was positive, but it wasn't overwhelmingly positive. We would think of something above 3% as being really strong. So 1.4 is sort of moderate growth rate. Again, so knife edge, very slight advantage for a Democrat, but hardly. Okay, fundamental number three, incumbency duration. So here's the idea that the longer an incumbent party has been in office, the more tiresome voters get of that party. And so what the record tells us is that if you are an incumbent president who's only been in office one term, you tend to have an advantage. Usually incumbent presidents win. But a party that has held the White House for 2 terms or more usually loses. And so if you think about this historical context, right? So when Bill Clinton ran in 1992, Republicans were essentially seeking a 4th term in office because you had 2 terms of Reagan and 1 term of George H.W. Bush, and Republicans were seeking a 4th term. And we don't usually do that. We don't usually give parties a 4th term in office. Okay. All right, so what did the fundamentals tell us in 2016? So fundamental 1 and fundamental 2, incumbency approval rate and the state of the economy, were very, very slight Democratic advantage. And fundamental number 3 was clearly a Republican advantage. Obama had been in office for 2 years. Usually we don't elect a party for a 3rd term in office. And so that one would be an advantage for the Republicans. So slight advantage for Democrats in 1 and 2, Republican advantage in number 3. That's kind of a mix. It suggests a close election, which in fact we had. What do the fundamentals tell us to apply this to 2020? So incumbent approval rating is quite low. And I don't think I put the numbers in the slides. I didn't. But if you look at a graph that shows President Trump's approval ratings over the course of his presidency, what you'll notice is that he's underwater for his entire presidency. He's never had an approval rating above 50%. It hovers around 42% or so, plus or minus. And so that's a clear Democratic advantage. Number 2, state of the economy. The state of the economy is quite poor. We've got 10% unemployment. However, most people associate the state of the economy with the pandemic. And there are suggestions that the economy is improving relative to where it was at the worst point in the spring of the pandemic. So most objective indicators here would say it's a Democratic advantage, but Republicans have a different spin on that. So there might be some room for interpretation there. Fundamental number 3, incumbency duration. This one here is a clear Republican advantage. President Trump has been in office for just 1 term. Republicans have been in office in the White House here, having just taken it from Democrats in 2016. So that one's a Republican advantage. The fundamentals here tell us that sort of 2 counts for Democrat, 1 count for Republican. Democrats should have the advantage in 2020. However, I'm going to put a big caveat on this because fundamentals may matter less in a period of strong polarization. And they may be less predictive in 2020. So extreme partisan polarization weakens the predictiveness of the fundamental models, these 3 fundamentals that I've talked about. And we have extreme polarization that I'll get into here in a minute. Second, the perceived economic state is more important than the actual economic state. So even if unemployment is at 10%, if people think we're climbing out of it, that perception of improvement might be more important than any objective indicator. Third, the economic measures tend to overvalue the wealthy. So if we're looking at GDP, if we're looking at the stock market and things like that, those are economic indicators that don't tell us something about the whole economy. They just tell us something about the upper echelon of the economy. And that may weaken that fundamental indicator for telling us something about elections. And then finally, one thing you might object to or be noticing here is that if the fundamentals are so predictive at telling us what's going to happen in an election, I haven't told you anything about candidates or about the campaigns or any of this crazy horse race fundamental stuff or wild debates or anything that's going on. Like, I've just told you a story that says none of that matters. And it's just these 3 very structural factors that I could tell you about in July that have nothing to do with what happens in the campaign after that, before November. And so that might be kind of a hard pill to swallow, right? The literature here suggests that campaigns in some ways don't matter that much because the fundamentals are so important for understanding election outcomes, but it clearly isn't the case that the candidates can just sit back and do nothing and expect the fundamentals to carry them over the finish line. Okay, I'm gonna leave that one a little bit messy there. Let me talk about a few features that make 2020 different, and then we'll finally be set to get to our denouement and talk about the health of US democracy. Okay, so what makes 2020 unique? So one big thing that makes 2020 unique is, for the first time in American history, we have the opportunity as Americans to re-elect an impeached incumbent president, right? So this has never happened before. Second, oh, here's the graph I was just talking about. I was just 2 slides ahead. The incumbent approval rating has never been above 50%. So the orange line there is the disapproval rating and the green line is approval rating. President Trump's approval rating for the duration of his presidency has been remarkably stable, not a whole lot of variation there, and relatively low in historic terms. So that's pretty unusual. Third, we have extreme polarization in the American electorate, and I'll get into that a little bit more in a second. Fourth, we have the pandemic to throw on top of that, and I'll talk about that a little bit more. We have had historic and widespread racial justice protests. They've been going on since 2012 and since the Black Lives Matter movement started around 2013, but they've really hit a peak over the course of the summer in the aftermath of the very public death of George Floyd in Minneapolis. And so we can use some evidence to help us understand that. Okay, so all of this is a way to set up some things that we know about the dysfunction in the United States, the political dysfunction. And it really starts with an understanding of inequality in the United States. Because as we see various forms of inequality here, and we can talk about economic inequality, we can talk about racial inequality, we can talk about educational inequality, we can talk about unequal access to healthcare, but I'm going to put all of it into a bucket of understanding inequality. As inequalities worsen, it generates partisan polarization. I'm not going to have enough time today to go into all of the reasons that we think these problems exist or that they're connected to one another. But as polarization worsens, which means, when I say polarization, I mean you get more extremism among Republicans and Democrats, and the distance between the two parties grows, then that distance leads to the conditions of gridlock. Because essentially what happens is as the two parties get further apart, the cost of losing to your political opponent increase. And it reduces the incentive to negotiate with one another or to compromise over things. And so you get gridlock. And as you get gridlock, you get a decline of democratic norms. You get political opponents who are less willing to engage with one another and essentially less willing to play nice in the sandbox and to treat one another with respect. And as those norms degrade, guess what? It exacerbates inequality. And then you have this cycle of dysfunction that becomes self-perpetuating. And this is where the United States finds itself right now. And when you throw on top of all of that a pandemic, what the pandemic largely does, the number one thing that the pandemic does, is it exacerbates the inequality feature, which to me is the number one catalyst for this whole cycle. And so it makes all of the dysfunction worse. Okay. I'm going to skip through some of these next slides more quickly so I make sure to leave enough time for questions and answers. And some of this is, I'm guessing, going to be familiar to a bunch of you, which is that we have polarization in the United States. So this is a graph that describes polarization in the House and the Senate. And the main observation that I want to make here, or want you to notice, is that the polarization in the House and the Senate starts in the 1970s. So it suggests that polarization in the United States, first of all, isn't driven by voters, but driven more by elites. And it's not driven by Donald Trump or Barack Obama or either of the Clintons. And it's driven by polarization that occurred due to structural changes in policy and politics that began in the aftermath of the Civil Rights Movement. So you get the Civil Rights Movement in the 1950s, 1960s. You get a bunch of big policy changes in the 1970s after Richard Nixon is impeached or rather removed from office. And that starts the conditions for inequality and polarization in the United States. And what we know a bunch of things about polarization at this point, but a couple of the things that we want to observe is that polarization is worsening over time. And in fact, the rightward shift among Republicans has been more extreme than the leftward shift among Democrats. So we have more homogeneity among Republicans, whereas Democrats still have more diversity within their coalition, so to speak, and more extremism. There's more extremism on both sides, but the right has moved further right than the left has moved left. And this heightens sort of the toxicity that's gone on in the Republican Party that has driven some of this polarization. I'm not going to take the time to go through all of these graphs, but basically the point of this slide is to show that as elites polarize, then the electorate polarizes, the mass public polarizes. And the closer you pay attention to politics, the more you're noticing what's going on in the world, the more likely you are, in fact, to become more extreme and to gain distance from your political opposite. This is a graph that emphasizes income inequality. So since 1980, the top 1% of income earners, shown in orange here, their income has increased by 50% in those 40 years. And the bottom 50% of income earners, their income, their share of income in the United States has declined by 50% over that same time period. So we've seen an extreme polarization of incomes, inequality, imbalance in incomes that has heightened this polarization cycle I've talked about. Okay. I'm not going to have time to go into all of this. I regret now that I put so much detail into this relatively short talk, but I'll just mention these ideas, and if you want to push me on them in the Q&A, that's fine. Partisanship has become more a part of people's core identity, like we think of gender and race. Partisanship is now right up there. And as partisans diverge, they tend to see the world through different lenses. And this gets heightened by the way media operates in the United States today. And it means that Republicans and Democrats literally live in different information environments. And so there are fewer shared facts that they all agree on. And as that happens, they tend to feel threatened by the other group. So you have this sort of in-group, out-group identification process that goes on, and it's very psychological. It's driven by political institutions and then exacerbated by the way human brains work, by psychology. But as that sense of threat increases by your political outgroup, when you get exposed to your political other, your political outgroup, it has that sense of increase the cost of losing to your opponents, which makes you less willing to compromise, less willing to bargain, and more likely to go to any extreme that you might need to go to, including in some cases using violence to make sure that those evil people don't win, whoever you think the evil side is. And of course, the pandemic affects all of this because you've had economic downturn, you've had increased anxiety, you've had downward pressure on the incumbent party. We can't gather in public in the same way. Vote by mail is become more difficult for a lot of people, although Virginia has actually done a fantastic job on that score. And the president is stoking uncertainty in the legitimacy of the institution of elections by discrediting vote by mail as a process. And so that's a huge problem. Okay, another big elephant in the room that I've sidestepped, but we need to address head on, has to do with the way racial injustice and racial inequality affects all of these things that I'm talking about. And there's this wonderful study that just happened to be published earlier this year by a political scientist at Princeton named Omar Wasow, who studied the social protest movements of the 1960s to understand the relationship between racially driven social unrest and elections. And his question was essentially, do protests help Democrats or help Republicans? As there's more social protests regarding racial injustice, does that help Democratic candidates, or does it result in white backlash? Because we've got this history in the United States where every time we make racial progress, it's met with white backlash. Civil War, Reconstruction, met by Jim Crow, and repeat. So, and his answer that he finds in this research is that it depends. Again, too much in this graph to go into detail here, but let me just try to break this down briefly. So the x-axis is a county level change in Democratic vote share. So anything above 0 here is more votes for Democrats, and below 0 is more votes for Republicans. And what he did was he looked at protests in the 1960s around the civil rights movement, and he showed that in counties where there were nonviolent protests, Democratic candidates tend to win more. And in counties where there were violent protests, Republican candidates were advantaged. And so essentially what he found is that protests do affect elections, but how they are described in the media and how people perceived them determined what effect they had on the elections. So if the media is out there saying these protests are largely peaceful and people feel empathy with those who are talking about racial justice and showing and describing racial justice, then it is more likely to help Democratic candidates. But in cases where they talk about rioting and they talk about backlash and they talk about, you know, they show sort of the downside of what can happen in racial protests that go awry, and people feel threatened by those who are marching in the streets, then it advantages the sort of law and order Republican narrative. Okay, this is one quick graph to emphasize the idea that Republicans and Democrats live in different information environments. And I pulled this one from the Pew Research Group and sort of recalibrated their data to show that the importance of elite messaging. So because President Trump is out there using all of this messaging in which he says, vote by mail is a problem, and if you're, you know, sending out unsolicited mail ballots is an invitation for fraud, this is his message. It turns out Republicans think that vote by mail is a pretty big problem, a major problem, in fact, and a majority, 70%, think it's a major or a minor problem. But Democrats, by a majority, believe that it's not a problem. And so this comes down to Republicans and Democrats living in completely different information environments when it comes to understanding the security of vote by mail and how important the president's sort of mouthpiece is when it comes to understanding the integrity of elections. Okay, the other elephant in the room is, of course, the vacancy on the Supreme Court. So Ruth Bader Ginsburg her passing has set off this battle. Republicans absolutely have the constitutional authority to fill the seat. I suspect they will. I suspect it will happen on the eve of the election. But doing so will shift the ideology of the court. There's a lot of politics that goes in here, and I'm essentially going to punt because I'm conscious of time. And I'll leave this here just to tantalize you. Okay. But the way the Supreme Court politics are important is because filling this seat in such a swift fashion violates a point that I'm going to make here in a minute about democratic norms. And the repeated violation of the norms that I'm going to summarize as being called respect and restraint is damaging to democratic institutions. And by Republicans pushing through a Supreme Court appointment in such a narrow and rapid time frame, close to an election on a party line vote, it violates the norm of what's known as institutional forbearance, in which political leaders don't use all the power that they have at their disposal out of a respect for their political opponents. Okay. Health of US democracy. I'm going to finally come to the main point of the whole talk. I've now given you enough background. Okay, I want to invite you to explore the resources that are been developed by this group of scholars at Dartmouth University called Bright Line Watch. And essentially they have this massive panel survey of experts, political scientists and historians and constitutional law scholars and so forth, in which they ask these questions about how is American democracy doing? And what they've showed is that in historical terms, over the course of the last 2 centuries, American democracy is pretty strong. In a lot of ways, we're on some of our strongest footing than we have been over the entire period. And the main reason for that has to do with voting rights, right? So when the Constitution is founded, only 6% of the adult population is eligible to vote. And as more and more groups of the population gain suffrage rights over the course of the 19th and 20th century, we get more and more democratic. However, they've also shown that the American democracy is essentially on its weakest footing than it has been since 2017. So as we've gone through the Trump presidency, essentially, we have seen an erosion of democratic institutions and norms, such that it's sort of fallen from an expert rating of about 70 to an expert rating of about 60 over these 2 years. And so we are seeing a decline in American democracy in the recent period. What are they worried about? Well, scholars tend to point to things like elections and voting. So gerrymandering is a big problem. Participation not being high is a big problem. Malapportionment in the United States Senate and in the Electoral College, where votes don't have equal impact, is a big problem. The information environment, a difference between Republicans and Democrats, not having a set of shared facts, is a big problem. And violations of democratic norms. So patriotism being questioned, compromising not being sought, and not having sanctions for misconduct. All of these things are the things that scholars are pointing to as an erosion of democratic institutions and norms that contribute to a decline in health in US democracy. Okay, to briefly summarize this stuff I've been saying about democratic norms, I want to introduce you to this book with a very foreboding title called How Democracies Die, written by two political scientists at Schar at Harvard, Stephen Levitsky and Daniel Ziblatt, in which they essentially argue by looking at dozens of democracies across time, across the modern, last century or so, and look at the characteristics of what makes a democracy strong and what makes a democracy devolve. And essentially they show that the institutions are really important. So you have to have rule of law and you have to have free and fair elections and other components. But what holds up those institutions are the norms that the political actors themselves, the elites, follow. And there are two most important norms that they identify in their research. And they are mutual respect among political adversaries, meaning that political opponents respect one another's right to participate in the arena. This is what you did not see on the debate stage last night. You did not see political opponents respecting one another's right to speak, to engage in debate. What you saw is a preschool level airing of interruptions and grievances. And you saw it from both sides, but it was like 80-20, like the president did 80% of the interrupting and the insults. And so there was no respect for political adversaries. And the second norm that they point to is known as institutional forbearance, which essentially is the idea of restraint, that you don't use all the power at your disposal when you have power. And so what they show is that there has been severe degradation of democratic norms in the United States, and it is caused by the worsening polarization. So that cycle of dysfunction that I talked about earlier has contributed to those decline in democratic norms. And so this idea, I guess I talked about it already, but when you're threatened by your adversaries, you're less likely to compromise or to cede power. All right, I think this is the final slide. So the point, and I want to leave you on a positive note because this has all been a lot of doom and gloom. Democratic institutions are absolutely under threat in the United States, but elections are a form of local, and I want to emphasize the local there. You notice we don't have national elections. Yeah, we have one national election day, but we don't use a popular vote. We don't use national referendum. All elections are local elections. They are state and or county or municipal level elections, even for president because of the Electoral College. So elections are a form of local, social, and civic action that creates bonds between citizens. And alone, elections themselves are not sufficient to help democracy endure. But with sustained attention to democratic norms, democratic values, and the common bonds that citizens share, elections can help us to right the path and strengthen democracy. All right, I'll leave you on that optimistic note. I will stop my screen share. Forgive me, please, for having talked so quickly and tried to fit so much information into such a short space. But I had a lot of content I wanted to try to get at you. So I hope that wasn't overwhelming, but I'm very happy to take your questions. Okay, I see that there is a question here first from Catherine. Do you think that misperceptions about the strength or function of the economy will be a driving factor in the presidential elections result? Yeah, I do, because state of the economy is essentially one of those three fundamentals that we use to understand election outcomes. And this is where that differentiated information environment becomes a bit of a problem. And essentially, people can build their own reality, their own information reality. If you want to believe that the economy is fine or the economy is getting better, then there is information out there to support that narrative. And there are leaders who will tell you that narrative. But if you are inclined to believe that the economy is bad and that things are dire, there is data out there and politicians out there also to support that narrative. And so this is where those three election fundamentals are less informative for helping us to understand election outcomes because the fundamentals are understood differently by Republicans and Democrats because of the information environment. And I didn't get into the media stuff at all because, you know, had to leave something out of the talk, if you can believe that. But there's a wonderful book that I really like right now, written by Danigal Young, who's a political scientist and communications and political psychology scholar up at University of Delaware. And she has this wonderful book called Irony and Outrage. And it's all about how, both about the political psychology, but the media environment that liberals are attracted to and that and conservatives are attracted to. And what she shows is that liberals are attracted to like late night comedy because they're comfortable with ambiguity and uncertain endings and irony, essentially, and they can appreciate irony. And so they watch, the late night talk show hosts and things like that. Whereas Republicans, conservative brains are much more attracted to certainty and security and knowing what you need to do to be safe and where the threats are coming from. And so that type of psychology is much more attracted to a media environment that peddles in outrage, that peddles in helping you identify what you should be afraid of and where the threats are in society. And so that's where a lot of the commentary on Fox News and the right-wing radio talk show hosts, they excel in that type of identify the threat and make you feel outraged kind of rhetoric. And so liberals and conservatives are literally choosing their media diets based on the things that their brain is psychologically wired to be most attracted to. It's a great book. I love her book. She got a TED Talk out now too. It's only 10 minutes long. You should go look for it. Danigal Young. What kinds of effects will or have the increase of polarization and gridlock have on the creation and implementation of public policy? Great. Okay. Two thoughts come to mind on that. One is that polarization and legislative gridlock contribute to a dysfunctional policy environment, right? It's just harder to pass laws. And it's different in the House than it is in the Senate, because the House is essentially a strongly majoritarian institution. Whichever party has the votes can pass stuff. And we've seen that in recent Congresses, both when Republicans are in majority and Democrats were in majority. The Senate, however, is more of a minoritarian institution. It's got these institutional features that, first it's got this incredible malapportionment where, the 53 million people in California, or excuse me, the 40 million people in California get the same number of senators as the 500,000 people in Wyoming. And then you've got these other institutional features of the Senate that make it easier for individual senators to slow the process down. And so because the Senate is not majoritarian institution, makes it almost impossible to develop policy coalitions on contentious policy issues, right? So you can't just get your majority together and get the votes, because a majority can't get policy passed. And to the extent that you need to build broader coalitions to get policy passed, it's harder to do so because of the polarization. And so those two things together, the partisan polarization mixed with the institutional features of the Senate, which get replicated in the Electoral College, create gridlock, create the conditions for gridlock. And so that has huge implications for the policy environment. It's hard to solve policy problems of any type when you have those institutional barriers. The second big answer to this question, I think, has more to do with whether or not we can use policy to affect the polarization itself, not just questions about, justice or environment or whatever policy issues we want to try to address, but whether or not we could use the policy process to affect polarization. And there, I think the answer is absolutely yes. Scholars, in terms of sort of trying to cure polarization, which is pretty tough, there's two schools of thought or two potential streams of going about it. One is a big institutional change stream. Amend the Constitution, abolish the Electoral College, add new states, expand the size of the House, pass the ERA, like all sorts of huge institutional changes that are frankly very difficult to do, but might go a long way to affecting polarization. The other bucket, the other stream of possibilities for affecting polarization is in policy. Because, as I described, one of the sources of polarization is inequality. And policy is a place that we can affect inequality through tax laws to affect income inequality, using tax laws for income redistribution, using policy to improve racial justice and access to healthcare and environmental justice and so forth. And so to the extent that you could pass policies that affected those sources of inequality, you could then use that to perhaps alleviate some of the polarization. And a caveat that I want to add here is that you don't have to do all of this at the national level. So to the extent that activists, I think, are interested in both affecting inequality and putting downward pressure on polarization, one of the places they should be looking is in the states and in counties and in localities and townships. Because there are changes that can be made at the very local levels of government, where frankly most government is, that there are policies in those places that exacerbate income inequality and racial inequality and generate racial segregation and the criminal justice system where lots of racial inequality exists. And there are changes and progress that can be made at the local level. And frankly, those local levels are not as polarized and not as gridlocked and dysfunctional as we see at the national level. So I think there's a lot of hope there, actually. But we haven't been so organized around it because our politics has become so nationalized. Okay, I feel like I'm talking at you a lot. But what else do you want to ask? These are great questions.
Professor Victor, I'll ask a question. This is
Okay,
Paul. I'm curious, and I've always been curious about this. To what extent do you think social media has had and the changes in how social media is used has had an impact on elections? I've been thinking about how, in 2008, Facebook being a public for not more than just college students was a brand new thing. In 2012, you had a lot of the factors that you talked about that gave the Democrats an advantage. And then in 2016, it was the real first test of social media during an election time. So how much of an impact do you think that had?
So and I'm glad you brought up Facebook specifically, because I think social media has differential effects on elections and democracy, depending on which platform you're talking about, just because the platforms work differently. And Facebook is an important one, basically for a couple of reasons. One, because it's the biggest one. Like, Facebook is gigantic. And it's hard to really fathom how huge Facebook is, not just in terms of number of users, but in terms of the diversity of the users, the size of the corporation, in both in revenue and also the size of its lobbying power. I saw numbers recently, and I'm not going to try to repeat them because I don't remember the specifics enough to say it in a credible way, but I saw the numbers on how many lobbyists Facebook employs to lobby at the state government level and national government level, and it is phenomenal. They just have so many resources that they can throw at this stuff. In any case, there's a wonderful study done by a political scientist down at William and Mary College. Her name is Jamie Settle, Settle, and she's got a book out in the last couple of years called Frenemies. And it's all about, she uses experiments and other types of quantitative research to try to discern how and whether Facebook in particular contributes to polarization in our political environment. And what she finds, just to cut to the chase, is that yes, it does. And the reason it does is really fascinating. And she's got these cool studies that she describes very nicely in her book. But basically what she describes is that Facebook has this interface in which you go online and you get this multimedia. So it's visual with pictures and it's words and it's people that you know. And it's this combination of cat videos and first day of school pictures and like stories and anecdotes that sort of tug at your heartstrings, combined with political information. And I got so mad about this thing I saw, and here's a ad from a politician, and I went on this protest march and I'm really pissed off about this and come protest with me and whatever. And the fact that these two information streams are right there in front of your face and you can doom scroll till your eyes bleed is psychologically polarizing, is what she finds. Essentially, because what happens is the cat videos and the stories from your niece's kids or whatever sort of prime your brain for empathetic, sort of psychological softening in a sense. And then you get hit with the political information and you wind up having a more emotional reaction to the political information than you would have in absence of the cat videos and stories about your aunt's kids. And so because Facebook has this mix of emotion and politics in the same information stream, it exacerbates polarization because we wind up responding to politics in a more emotionalized way than we would if we better separated our politics from our cat videos and funny stories. And so to that extent, like some responsible users of Facebook, I think, and I've tried to do this actually a little bit in my own life, is only use it for cat videos and Halloween pictures, or only use it for politics, but try not to mix them because that's where the problematic psychology comes in that exacerbates polarization. So I really like Jamie's book on this stuff. The evidence about Twitter is a little bit more mixed, and some of the other social media platforms. In Twitter, you're more likely to get exposed to countervailing information. You know, you're not just trapped in an echo chamber, depending on who you follow and so forth, but it's more likely that you'll get exposed to countervailing information in Twitter than it is in Facebook, just because of the way the algorithms work behind the platforms. Catherine's building off the social media question. Do you believe that the energy being poured into registering to vote, etc., will truly improve turnout in 2020? I'm gonna tear apart your question just a little bit because it's two things. One is that, yes, I think turnout is going to be very high in 2020 for a couple of reasons. One is turnout was extremely high in 2018, and the best indicator of turnout in the next election is turnout in the last election. And two, because democracy is on the ballot. Like, you know, if this wasn't clear in the way that I made the presentation, I do believe that if Donald Trump is reelected, we may not be a democracy anymore. The violations, the consistent one on top of the other in rapid fire, building on one another, violations of democratic norms, democratic values that are tearing down democratic institutions, and lack of respect for the rule of law, separation of powers don't work anymore. The more that stuff happens, the more we devolve away from democracy and towards another form of government. You might call it, some comparative scholars would call it electoral democracy, some would call it competitive authoritarianism. Depending on what happens, we can't quite put a label on it yet, and there's a lot of debate and room for debate there. But democracy is on the ballot. And when democracy is threatened, when people feel like their rights are at stake, they're more likely to turn out to vote. So election turnout will be high in 2020, but I don't know if it's going to be high for the reason that you suggested. And because the question already ran away, I forgot. Oh, you said all of the information. So maybe the turnout will be high because we're doing so much more with trying to get people to turn out to vote and voter registration and more access to the ballot and early voting and all of this, that kind of stuff. Like, it's getting easier to vote, particularly in places like Virginia, than it used to be. But so that might be part of it, but also democracy being threatened is part of it. Also, recent previous turnout being high is part of it. So turnout will be high. We may not be fully sure why turnout is high, but it's, you know, actually, that's a great research question. We should write that down and go write a paper. Okay. Such a good point. It seems like there are several effective ways both to target inequality, but also address polarization through policy. Agreed. Is there sufficient backing by political actors right now for these kinds of changes? Are they feasible? This is a great question, because this is actually one of those things that keeps me up at night, not just the destroying democratic norms stuff, because that one does keep me up at night, literally, but I don't hear enough politicians, incumbents, challengers, anybody, lower levels, higher levels, I don't hear enough talk about making the institutional changes we need to change to fix democracy. Whether it's about big reforms, like, you know, amending the Constitution to do different kinds of things, or small level policy, like changing zoning laws to help address racial segregation. And there's lots of stuff in between those. I sort of think of those as almost two extremes. There's lots of things we should be talking about to address these problems: structural problems, policy problems, polarization problems. And I don't hear enough politicians talking about either bucket, either the policy bucket or the institutional bucket. And I think that's a big problem. I think we need a lot more discussion. We need a lot more study. We need a lot more creative thinking to the extent that there are people talking about it, I get worried that frankly, they're having the wrong conversations, right? So to be perfectly frank, like right now, what Democrats are talking about is stacking the Supreme Court, right? So in all likelihood, the justice that's been nominated, Amy Coney Barrett, is going to be approved probably on the eve of the election. Democrats will be really pissed off about it. And if the polls stay where they are, then Biden will win the election. Democrats may win the Senate, although that one's more iffy. There will be some cries within the Democratic Party that we should expand the court to 12 members or 15 members or whatever it is they want to do. And frankly, I think that would be a huge mistake, because in my mind, that political strategy lacks as much forbearance as putting Barrett on the court in the first place does. It's the same sort of tit for tat, you screwed me, so now I'm going to screw you in the next round strategy that is part of our political antagonism that the parties are locked in right now, that's contributing to Democratic dissolution. So if that's where Democrats take it, if that's the lesson that they take, is by going sort of balls in, sorry for the language, on breaking more democratic norms and more lack of forbearance, then that's a huge mistake. And not only is it a mistake because I think it further breaks democracy, but because there are so many other things that they could do that don't violate the forbearance rule, that would improve democracy. Like pass the, what are they calling it now? The John Lewis Voting Rights Act. Like do whatever you can to shore up the Voting Rights Act. Do whatever you can to improve environmental justice, to address income inequality through tax law, to address residential zoning laws at local level. Like there's a zillion things we can do. Talk about expanding the size of the House. Talk about adding DC and Puerto Rico as states. You could make an argument about forbearance there too, but it's just so like the right thing to do that, you know, there's 4 million Americans who don't have representation in Congress. Like that's a problem. So, okay, I'm getting shrill now. I'm tired. I stayed up till 3 a.m. because of all the drama last night. You guys got me on a roll. Okay, but we've kind of run out of time. So I don't know if somebody has a last question that I can try to answer briefly and tie up, but otherwise I'll let the moderators make the call here.
I think I have one last question if it helps. And this is probably a super broad question, and you kind of touched upon it with your answer, your previous answer. But I guess for you know, anybody who's looking into getting into the political science or public policy arena, you did say, you know, you can focus on different policies to help not to increase that polarization. But I guess, do you have any kind of other broader encouragement for those people not to kind of get sucked into that arena of polarization and targeting and threatening? I guess just how, yes, what would you say to these future policymakers in order for them to keep more of an open mindset when they're, you know, it's different to learn about it, but once they're in it, how can you help them keep a broader perspective?
Yep, no, this is a great question. So I have two answers and I'll try to make them pretty brief. So one is a strategy that I use with my students in which in most of my classes, we talk about current events and we sort of apply political science and try to understand news through a political science lens. So they're reading the news all the time and we're talking about it. And the advice that I give them when they're being consumers of political information is to try to do it in as dispassionate a way as they can, right? So the way news is sold to us these days is purposefully designed to get a rise out of us. It's just, most news is designed to stoke emotional reaction. And so you have to learn just through practice to try to suppress that, to try to read news headlines and read stories in a way that makes you go, huh, I wonder why that's the case, rather than, oh my God, I'm so mad about that, or oh my gosh, that makes me so sad, or whatever it is, right? Try to be dispassionate or objective or neutral, or pretend like you are like the Zen mindful, I'm just observing what's going on in this world and going to narrate to you what I observe kind of thing. Because the more you practice consuming news in that type of kind of cold, detached fashion, the better you can process information. And the better you can take that information and feed it into what you know about how policymaking works and everything else that you learn in class. But it's hard. It's really hard. You have to retrain your brain really to do it. And the second thing that I would add is a strategy that works both for policymakers who are dealing with antagonistic people, but also like I think at the dinner table when you're talking to your crazy uncle who has weird ideas about politics. And that is like, how do you engage in politics or political discussions with people these days when politics is so acrimonious? And I use a strategy that I call the 3 C's. And so the 3 C's are calm, connect, and correct. And so that is when you're in a discussion with somebody, maybe it's an online discussion, maybe it's a dinner table discussion, maybe it's a professional, policymaker discussion, whatever it is, where the person you're talking with is raising their voice or starting to give incorrect information, or it's just becoming a more tense political conversation. What you do is first you breathe, so you stay calm. Meeting raised voices with more raised voices doesn't solve anything. You saw Joe Biden trying to do this last night, largely successfully, but not entirely. So you got to stay calm. That's number 1. And then number 2 is connect. And that is find something in what your interlocutor is talking about that you can connect with. Find something you can validate, that you can affirm, whether it's a substantive point or maybe just validate your feelings. Like, I understand why this makes you so mad. It makes me mad too. Like, even if it's just validating their feelings, like find something on which to make a point of connection with them. And then the third is to correct. So once you've made a point of connection, now you have a bridge, and you use that bridge to correct the misinformation or the inaccuracy or the failure of logic or the cognitive bias or whatever it is, the mistake that they've made. You gently correct them. And if you can use language of that type and follow that kind of strategy, you're more likely to wind up in a situation where that person will actually hear you. They may not, and they may still be defensive and dismiss you and insult you and whatever, depending on who they are and what the situation is. And then your best strategy may still be to walk away, which is maybe what Biden should have done. I don't know. But it I think at least provides the opportunity or the possibility for actual productive interaction, which is what we need from our policymakers, to be able to interact with one another, find points of connection with one another, and use those potential points of connection on which to build compromises or points of agreement or policy negotiation or whatever it is.
Thank you. That was super helpful. And that was a really great talk. Thank you so much. I know a lot of the questions I had because, my background's actually in science. So a lot of my questions were answered. That was very, very knowledgeable. Thank you so much. So I guess we'll go ahead and wrap up. For everyone attending tonight, thank you so much for coming by. If you are interested in learning any more about our admissions or application process, or just about the Schar School in general, please feel free to reach out to me. I'm going to leave my email in the chat. Or if there's any other faculty member that you want to chat with, or anybody at the Schar School, feel free to leave me an email as well, and I'll definitely get you connected.